Behind the golden gates of Windsor Castle, where tradition runs deeper than the Thames and secrets are guarded more carefully than crown jewels, a security guard's routine patrol would uncover something that would change everything. What he witnessed that cold November evening wasn't meant for any eyes but those within the inner circle of the royal family. The portrait hall, usually silent except for the tick of ancient clocks, echoed with sounds no guard had ever heard in 30 years of service. The future King of England, the man who had waited decades to wear the crown, sat alone beneath the watchful eyes of his ancestors, and he was crying. But these weren't just tears of grief or momentary sadness. These were the tears of a man whose world had just been turned upside down by a single conversation. A revelation so profound that it threatened to shake the very foundations of the monarchy itself. What had Camilla told him during her unexpected visit? What secret had been buried for so long that its emergence could reduce one of the most powerful men in the world to tears? And why was this moment, captured only by the silent witnesses of painted kings and queens, about to become the catalyst for the most dramatic royal crisis in modern history? The guard who stumbled upon this scene had no idea that he was witnessing the beginning of a story that would span continents, involve long-buried family secrets, and ultimately force the royal family to confront truths they had spent decades trying to hide. This is the story of that night, and the 5 days that followed, days that would forever change the British monarchy and the life of the man destined to be king. James Mitchell had been walking the same corridors of Windsor Castle for 28 years. Every creak of the ancient floorboards, every shadow cast by the ornate chandeliers, every whisper of wind through the massive windows was as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. At 55, he had seen 3 different monarchs, countless state dinners, royal weddings, and diplomatic crises. Nothing surprised him anymore, or so he thought. The evening of November 15th started like any other. The autumn rain drummed against the windows as James began his routine patrol at 9:30. The royal family had finished dinner hours ago, and most had retired to their private quarters. The castle felt peaceful, settling into its nightly rhythm of quiet dignity. James moved through the east wing methodically, his footsteps muffled by centuries-old Persian rugs. He checked the library, the music room, and the various sitting areas that dotted this wing of the castle. Everything was as it should be. The only sounds were the distant hum of heating systems and the occasional settling of the ancient building. As he approached the portrait hall, something made him pause. There was a sound he couldn't immediately identify, soft, rhythmic, almost like someone trying to catch their breath. James had developed sharp instincts over his decades of service. Every guard knew that unusual sounds in the castle required investigation, no matter how harmless they might seem. He moved closer to the portrait hall, his hand instinctively moving to the radio clipped to his belt. The sound was clearer now, and James felt a chill run down his spine. Someone was crying. Not the soft weeping of a servant or staff member, but the deep, wrenching sobs of someone in profound emotional pain. James hesitated. His training told him to investigate any unusual activity, but his experience whispered caution. The portrait hall was often used by members of the royal family for private moments of reflection. Disturbing such a moment could cost him his job, or worse. But the crying continued, growing more intense. It was the kind of crying that spoke of devastation, of a world turned upside down. James had heard such sounds before, during his service in the military years ago, when men received news that shattered their lives. This wasn't simple sadness or momentary grief. This was the sound of a soul in crisis. Taking a deep breath, James stepped into the portrait hall. The sight that greeted him would be burned into his memory for the rest of his life. Prince William sat in one of the ornate chairs positioned before the massive portrait of King George VI. His usually composed demeanor was completely gone. His shoulders shook with each sob, and his hands covered his face as tears streamed between his fingers. The future King of England, the man who had always embodied strength and dignity, was completely broken. James stood frozen in the doorway. In all his years of service, through every crisis and celebration, he had never seen any member of the royal family in such a state. William was always the picture of composure, the steady presence who had guided the monarchy through its most challenging modern moments. The prince's suit jacket lay crumpled on the floor beside his chair, his tie loosened and his shirt collar unbuttoned. Papers were scattered on the small table next to him, and James could see what looked like old photographs among them. Whatever had happened, whatever had reduced William to this state, was serious beyond anything James had encountered in his career. For a moment, James considered retreating quietly, pretending he had never seen this private moment of anguish. But something in the intensity of William's distress made him step forward. This wasn't just personal grief. The very air in the room felt heavy with the weight of crisis. "Your Royal Highness," James said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. William's head snapped up, his eyes red and swollen from crying. For a moment he looked like a lost child rather than a future king. The vulnerability in his expression was heartbreaking and terrifying in equal measure. "James," William said, his voice hoarse and broken. I didn't hear you coming." The guard had known William since he was a boy, had watched him grow from a playful child into a responsible man carrying the weight of future kingship. But he had never seen him like this, completely stripped of his royal composure, raw and human, in a way that seemed to shock even William himself. "Sir, is everything all right? Should I call for assistance?" James asked, though he already knew the answer. Nothing about the situation was all right. William wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture so ordinary and human that it somehow made the scene even more surreal. The portraits of his ancestors looked down from the walls, their painted eyes seeming to witness this moment of royal vulnerability. "No," William said, though his voice cracked with the effort of speaking. "No, please don't call anyone. I need a moment." But James could see this was far more than needing a moment. The scattered papers on the table told a story of documents reviewed and re-reviewed, of information that had clearly devastated the prince. Among the papers, James glimpsed what looked like old hospital records, birth certificates, and photographs that seemed to be from decades past. "Has something happened to the family, sir?" James ventured, his protective instincts overriding protocol. In this moment, his concern for the prince superseded all rules about appropriate interaction between staff and royalty. William looked at him with eyes that held a depth of pain James had rarely seen. It was the look of someone whose entire understanding of their life had been fundamentally altered. "My family," William repeated slowly as if testing the words. "James, what if everything you believed about your family, about yourself, turned out to be a lie?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that James couldn't begin to understand. But he could see that whatever William had learned, whatever had brought him to this state, was something that struck at the very core of his identity. The prince stood up slowly, moving to stand before the portrait of his great-grandfather. King George VI gazed back with the same steady determination that had guided Britain through World War II. The irony wasn't lost on James. He was another royal crisis, another moment when the monarchy faced challenges that seemed impossible to overcome. "She came to see me tonight," William said quietly, not turning away from the portrait. "Camilla. She said she couldn't keep the secret any longer. She said I deserved to know the truth before." William's voice trailed off, but James could hear the weight of whatever revelation had been shared. The guard remained silent, understanding instinctively that this was a moment when listening was more important than speaking. "Before what, sir?" James finally asked. William turned back to face him, and James saw something new in his expression. Not just pain, but fear, real, genuine fear from a man who had faced public scrutiny, media hatred, and personal tragedy with unwavering composure. "Before I become king," William whispered. "Before I take an oath to a country and a crown that might not even be rightfully mine." The implications of these words hit James like a physical blow. Whatever Camilla had told William, it wasn't just personal family drama. This was something that threatened the very legitimacy of the succession, something that could shake the foundation of the monarchy itself. James looked around the portrait hall, at the painted faces of kings and queens who had ruled for centuries, and realized he was witnessing a moment that could change the course of British history. The future King of England sat before him, broken and uncertain, holding secrets that could destroy everything the royal family represented. The rain continued to pound against the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed 10 o'clock. In this ornate room, surrounded by centuries of royal history, James Mitchell, a simple security guard, found himself at the center of what might become the greatest royal crisis in modern times. William picked up one of the photographs from the table, staring at it with an expression of heartbreaking confusion. James couldn't see the image clearly, but he could see how William's hands trembled as he held it. 28 years you've worked here, James," William said suddenly. "In all that time, have you ever questioned whether the people you've protected, the family you've served, were truly who they claimed to be?" The question was impossible to answer, loaded with implications that James couldn't fully grasp. But as he looked at the devastated prince before him, he realized that, whatever the truth was, it was big enough to reduce the future King of England to tears, and significant enough to threaten everything the monarchy stood for. The portrait hall fell silent, except for the rain, and the distant ticking of clocks. Two men, separated by birth and circumstance but united in this moment of crisis, stood among the painted witnesses of royal history, both understanding that nothing would ever be the same again. William moved away from the portraits and sank back into the chair, the photograph still clutched in his trembling hands. James remained standing, uncertain whether to stay or leave, but unable to abandon the prince in such obvious distress. "Sir, perhaps I should fetch the Princess of Wales, or—" James began. "No!" William's response was sharp, almost panicked. "Kate cannot know about this. Not yet. Not until I understand what it all means." The desperation in his voice told James that whatever secret had been revealed was too dangerous, too devastating to share even with his own wife.
This realization sent a chill through the experienced guard.
In all his years of service, he had never encountered a royal crisis that couldn't be shared within the immediate family. William set the photograph down on the table and buried his face in his hands again. When he spoke, his voice was muffled but clear enough for James to hear every heartbreaking word. "Do you remember the stories about my birth, James? The celebration, the joy, the heir to the throne finally born?" James nodded, though he wasn't sure William could see him. Everyone remembered that summer of 1982, when the nation had celebrated the birth of the future king. The newspapers had run stories for weeks, and the joy had been infectious throughout the kingdom. "It was all a lie," William whispered, his words cutting through the silence like a blade. "Everything about my birth, my parentage, my right to the throne, it's all been a carefully constructed lie." The words seemed impossible, too shocking to be real. James felt as if the ground beneath his feet had shifted. The monarchy's legitimacy rested on bloodlines that stretched back centuries. If what William was suggesting was true, the implications were staggering. William looked up, his eyes meeting James's with a directness that was both royal command and human plea for understanding. "Camilla brought me documents tonight. Hospital records, birth certificates, DNA test results that she's apparently been hiding for 40 years. He reached for another paper from the table, his hand shaking so badly he almost dropped it. "According to these records, I was not born at St. Mary's Hospital on June 21st, 1982. That was a different baby, a child who died within hours of birth." James felt his legs go weak. He reached for the back of a nearby chair to steady himself, trying to process what he was hearing. "The real Prince William, the biological son of Charles and Diana, died the same night he was born," William continued, his voice growing stronger as if speaking the truth was somehow liberating, even as it destroyed everything he had believed about himself. "I was born 3 days later to a woman named Sarah Mitchell in a small hospital in Scotland." The surname hit James like a physical blow. Mitchell, his own surname. But surely it was just a coincidence. William noticed his reaction immediately. "Your name," William said quietly. "When I saw you tonight, when you said your name, it was like the universe was providing one more confirmation of this nightmare." James found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Sir, surely there must be some mistake. These documents, they could be forged, or—" "That's what I thought," William interrupted. "That's what I hoped. But Camilla brought more than just papers. She brought this." He picked up the photograph he had been holding earlier and turned it toward James. The image was faded with age, but clear enough to see a young woman holding a newborn baby. The woman had dark hair and kind eyes, and she was smiling with the exhausted joy of new motherhood. "This is Sarah Mitchell," William said, "my birth mother." According to the documents, she was a nurse at the hospital where the royal family was secretly taken when Diana went into premature labor. When the real prince died, and when it became clear that Diana might not survive the complications from the birth, a desperate decision was made. James stared at the photograph, his mind racing. The woman did look familiar somehow, though he couldn't place why. The baby in her arms was clearly newborn, with the same facial features he had watched grow into the man sitting before him. "They took Sarah's baby, they took me, and claimed I was the royal heir who had survived," William continued. "Sarah was told her child had died in childbirth. She never knew that her son was raised as the future King of England." The implications crashed over James in waves. If this was true, then the entire succession was built on fraud. The Commonwealth realms, the Church of England, the constitutional monarchy itself, all of it rested on the legitimacy of the bloodline, and that bloodline had been broken 40 years ago. "But sir," James said desperately, "surely someone would have noticed. The physical differences, the resemblance." "Look at me, James," William said, standing up and moving closer. "Really, look at me. Have you ever wondered why I look so little like my father? Why my height, my build, even my mannerisms are so different from the rest of the family? James had always attributed these differences to Diana's influence, but as he studied William's features now, he could see what the prince meant. The strong jaw, the piercing eyes, even the way he carried himself. None of it really matched Charles or the Windsor bloodline. According to these records, Sarah Mitchell was 6 feet tall, with blue eyes and brown hair. She was athletic, intelligent, and had a background in nursing and social work, William said. Does that sound familiar? It sounded exactly like William himself. James felt the world tilting around him as the pieces fell into place with horrible clarity. But the secrecy, sir. How could something this massive be kept quiet for 40 years? William returned to the table and picked up another document. Only 5 people knew the truth. Charles, Diana, Camilla, the private physician who delivered both babies, and the Archbishop of Canterbury who was brought in to provide spiritual guidance during the crisis. He paused, his voice cracking again. Diana apparently spent the rest of her life tormented by the lie. According to Camilla, she wanted to tell me the truth before she died. But Charles forbade it. The doctor died in 1995, and the Archbishop passed away 2 years ago. That left only Charles and Camilla. And now Charles is... James began, then stopped, realizing the implications. Dying, William finished. He has weeks, maybe months left. Camilla said she couldn't bear to let me take the throne without knowing the truth. She said Diana would never have forgiven her if she let the lie continue after Charles was gone. The portrait hall seemed to close in around them as the weight of this revelation settled between them. James looked up at the painted faces of William's supposed ancestors and realized that none of them shared his blood. The careful lineage that the monarchy depended on had been severed decades ago, and the man destined to be king was not royal at all.
What about Sarah Mitchell?
James asked. What happened to her? William's expression grew even more pained. She's still alive. She lives in Edinburgh, working as a retired social worker. She never married, never had other children. According to these records, she spent decades volunteering with charities that help families who have lost children. The irony was devastating. The woman who had unknowingly given birth to the future King of England had spent her life helping other parents cope with loss, never knowing that her own child was alive and living a life of unimaginable privilege. She doesn't know, William whispered. Camilla said she has no idea that her son survived, let alone who he became. She spent 40 years mourning a child who was stolen from her. James felt tears in his own eyes as the full human tragedy of the situation became clear. This wasn't just about royal succession or constitutional crisis. This was about a mother who had lost her child and a son who had discovered that his entire life was built on a lie. What are you going to do, sir? James asked. William looked around the portrait hall one more time, his gaze lingering on each painted face. I don't know, he admitted. How do you choose between duty and truth? How do you decide whether to protect an institution or honor the woman who gave you life? He picked up the photograph of Sarah Mitchell again, studying her face with the desperate intensity of a man trying to see himself in a stranger's features. If I reveal the truth, it destroys the monarchy, he said quietly. Parliament would fall, the Commonwealth would fragment, and Britain would face a constitutional crisis unlike anything in our history. He set the photograph down and looked directly at James. But if I take the throne knowing this lie, I betray my birth mother, I live a fraud for the rest of my life, and I pass this terrible secret on to my own children. The choice was impossible, the kind of decision that no person should ever have to make. James realized he was witnessing not just the discovery of a royal scandal, but the complete destruction of a man's understanding of his own identity. Outside, the rain had intensified, and the wind rattled the ancient windows. In the portrait hall, surrounded by centuries of royal history, the future King of England faced a choice that would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of the monarchy itself. Whatever you decide, sir, James said quietly, you won't have to face it alone. William looked at him with gratitude that transcended the boundaries of royal protocol. In this moment of crisis, the distinction between prince and commoner seemed meaningless. They were just two men confronting a truth too big for either of them to handle alone. The next morning arrived grey and cold, matching the mood that had settled over Windsor Castle like a shroud. James had barely slept, his mind churning through the impossible revelations of the previous evening. He arrived for his day shift early, hoping to catch some sign of how William was handling the devastating truth he had learned. The castle felt different somehow, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Staff moved through their routines with the same efficiency as always, but James noticed the subtle signs of tension. The Prince of Wales's private secretary had arrived unusually early. Several encrypted phone calls had been made from the royal offices. Most telling of all, William himself was nowhere to be seen, having reportedly cancelled all his scheduled appointments for the day. Around mid-morning, James received an unexpected summons to the prince's private study. His heart raced as he made his way through the familiar corridors, wondering what William might need from him in the aftermath of their encounter. He found the prince standing by a tall window overlooking the castle grounds, still wearing the same clothes from the night before. The scattered documents had been organized into neat piles on his desk, and several laptops were open, displaying what appeared to be genealogical charts and historical records. "James," William said without turning around, "I need your help with something that goes far beyond your normal duties." The formality was gone from his voice, replaced by the exhausted determination of a man who had spent the night grappling with impossible choices. "Of course, sir." "Whatever you need." William turned to face him, and James could see that the prince had aged years in a single night. His eyes were red-rimmed from lack of sleep, and his usually perfect posture had given way to the slumped shoulders of a man carrying an unbearable weight. "I've been researching Sarah Mitchell all night," William said, gesturing to the computers. "I need to know everything about her, about what her life has been like. Before I decide what to do with this information," he moved to his desk and picked up a printout that appeared to be a recent photograph. "This is her now, James. This is my birth mother." James looked at the image and felt his breath catch. The woman was in her early 60s, with graying hair and kind eyes that were unmistakably familiar. She was standing outside what appeared to be a community center, surrounded by children. Her face lit up with the same warm smile from the photograph taken 40 years earlier. "She runs a youth center in Edinburgh," William continued, "has for the past 15 years. Before that, she worked as a social worker specializing in helping troubled teenagers. She's never married, never had other children, and she volunteers every weekend at a shelter for homeless families." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. While William had been raised in palaces with every privilege imaginable, his birth mother had dedicated her life to helping those society had forgotten. "There's more," William said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I found her medical records from 1982. She suffered severe depression after losing what she thought was her baby. She was hospitalized twice in the years following my birth, unable to cope with the grief." James felt his heart break for this woman he had never met, a mother who had unknowingly sacrificed everything for the son she didn't know she had raised. "I want to meet her," William said suddenly. "But not as the Prince of Wales. I want to see who she really is, understand what kind of person she is, before I decide whether to turn both our lives upside down."
"Sir, that's incredibly dangerous," James protested.
"If anyone recognizes you, that's why I need your help," William interrupted. "I can't do this through official channels. I can't send royal protection officers or have the meeting arranged through diplomatic channels. This has to be completely off the books." James understood immediately what was being asked of him. William wanted to arrange a clandestine meeting with his birth mother, without any of the usual royal protocol or security measures. It was dangerous, potentially scandalous, and absolutely necessary. "What did you have in mind, sir?" William moved to a map of Scotland that he had spread across a side table. Red marks indicated various locations throughout Edinburgh, with notes written in William's precise handwriting. "She goes to the same cafe every Tuesday morning," William explained. "A little place called The Thistle on Rose Street. She meets with a group of other retired social workers to discuss their volunteer projects." He pointed to a photograph that appeared to be taken from a distance, showing Sarah Mitchell sitting at a corner table with several other women, all of them animated in conversation. "I want to be there next Tuesday." Just another customer having coffee, close enough to observe her, to understand who she is as a person. James studied the map and the surveillance photographs with growing concern. "Sir, even with a disguise, the risk of recognition is enormous. And if this gets out, if anyone discovers what you're doing, the monarchy ends anyway," William finished. "James, I'm facing a choice between revealing the truth and destroying everything, or living a lie for the rest of my life. I need to understand what kind of woman my birth mother is before I can make that choice." The logic was undeniable, even if the risks were staggering. James looked at the prince and saw not just royal determination, but the desperate need of a son to understand his mother. "There's something else," William said, pulling out another document. "I've been researching the original cover-up, trying to understand exactly what happened in 1982. He spread hospital records across the desk, pointing to entries that had clearly been altered or falsified. The official story was that Diana had a difficult labor but gave birth to a healthy prince. But these records tell a different story. James leaned in to examine the documents, noting discrepancies in dates, times, and medical procedures that didn't align with the public narrative. Diana went into premature labor during a visit to Balmoral, William explained. She was rushed to a small private hospital that the royal family sometimes used for discreet medical needs. The real prince was born severely premature, with complications that made survival impossible. He paused, his voice breaking slightly. While Diana was fighting for her life after a traumatic delivery, Charles was faced with an impossible choice: announce the death of the heir and the possible death of the Princess of Wales, or find another solution. And Sarah Mitchell was there, James said, beginning to understand the horrible coincidence that had made the switch possible. She was a nurse at the hospital, working the night shift. She had gone into labor unexpectedly during her shift and gave birth in the same wing where Diana was fighting for her life, William continued. When her baby was born healthy and strong, and when it became clear that the royal heir wouldn't survive, someone made a decision that changed 4 lives forever. The calculated nature of the switch was staggering. James tried to imagine the chaos of that night, the desperate decisions made in moments of crisis that would echo for decades. Who made the actual decision? James asked. William's expression darkened. According to Camilla, it was Charles. Faced with the possibility of losing both his wife and his heir in the same night, he chose to take Sarah's baby and claim it as his own. And Sarah was told her baby died during delivery. The trauma of childbirth, combined with the supposed loss of her child, meant she was in no condition to question the medical staff. By the time she recovered enough to ask questions, the substitution was complete. James felt sick as the full scope of the deception became clear. This wasn't just about royal succession. It was about a mother robbed of her child and a son stolen from his true heritage. The records show that Sarah tried to see her baby's body, tried to understand what had happened, William continued. But she was told that cremation had already taken place due to medical protocols. She was given ashes from the royal heir and told they belonged to her son. The cruelty of the deception was breathtaking. James imagined this young woman, grieving what she thought was her dead child, never knowing that he was alive and being raised as the future king of England. "Sir, this goes beyond personal revelation," James said. "This is criminal fraud on a massive scale. The implications for the government, for Parliament, for every oath of allegiance sworn in your name." "I know," William interrupted. "That's why I need to meet her before I decide anything. I need to understand if she's strong enough to handle the truth, if she's the kind of person who would want to know, or if revealing this would destroy what's left of her life." They stood in silence for a moment, both overwhelmed by the magnitude of the situation. Outside, life at Windsor Castle continued its normal rhythm. Staff and visitors going about their business with no idea that the very foundation of the monarchy was crumbling in this small study. "If we do this," James said finally, "if I help you meet her, there's no going back. Once you see her face to face, once you understand who she really is, you'll have to make a choice that affects millions of people." William nodded grimly. "I know, but I can't live with this lie without understanding the woman it's been stolen from. She deserves that much, even if she never learns the truth." James looked at the photographs scattered across the desk, at this woman who had unknowingly shaped history through her loss, and realized that he was about to become part of the most significant royal crisis in centuries. "When do we leave for Edinburgh?" he asked. William's expression showed both gratitude and terror. "Tomorrow. We need to do this before I lose the courage and before anyone else discovers what we know." As they began planning their clandestine journey to Scotland, neither man could have imagined how much their simple desire to understand the truth would ultimately change the course of British history.
The journey to Edinburgh felt like traveling to another world.
William had insisted on taking James's personal car, a modest sedan that would never attract the attention that royal vehicles commanded. They had left Windsor at dawn, telling only William's most trusted aide that the prince was taking a personal day for reflection. William wore a simple wool sweater, jeans, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Glasses he didn't need, and a carefully cultivated stubble completed a disguise that transformed the future King of England into just another middle-aged man having coffee in a Scottish cafe. Still, James remained nervous about the risks they were taking. "Second thoughts?" William asked as they reached the outskirts of Edinburgh. "About a dozen," James admitted. "But I understand why we're here." They had spent the drive mostly in silence, both men lost in thought about what lay ahead. William had studied every piece of information about Sarah Mitchell, memorizing details about her life, her work, her habits. But nothing could prepare him for the reality of sitting in the same room as the woman who had given birth to him. The Thistle Cafe was exactly as William had described. A small, warm establishment with mismatched furniture and the kind of welcoming atmosphere that made it a natural gathering place for locals. They arrived early, choosing a table near the back that offered a clear view of the entrance while keeping William partially hidden behind a pillar. "She should be here in about 20 minutes, William whispered, his hand shaking as he lifted his coffee cup. James watched his companion carefully, noting the mixture of anticipation and terror in his eyes. This wasn't just about royal duty or constitutional crisis anymore. This was a son preparing to see his mother for the first time since birth, even if she would never know who he was. At exactly 10:30, the cafe door opened, and Sarah Mitchell walked in. James felt his breath catch as he saw her in person for the first time. The photographs hadn't captured the quiet dignity in her bearing, the way she moved with the confident grace of someone comfortable in her own skin. She was smaller than he had expected, but there was something in her posture that spoke of inner strength and resilience. She greeted the cafe owner by name, asked about his daughter's upcoming wedding, and inquired after a regular customer who had been absent recently. These weren't performative pleasantries, but genuine expressions of care and interest. This was a woman who made connections with everyone around her. "My God," William whispered, his voice barely audible. "Look at her hands." James followed his gaze and saw what had captured the prince's attention. Sarah's hands moved expressively as she talked, gesturing in patterns that were unmistakably familiar. William's own hands moved the same way when he was passionate about a subject, a mannerism that had always puzzled royal observers who noted it was unlike anyone else in the Windsor family. Sarah found her usual table near the window, and within minutes, 3 other women had joined her. James could hear fragments of their conversation, discussions about funding for youth programs, strategies for helping homeless families, debates about the best approaches to social work in underserved communities. "Listen to how she talks about the children," William murmured, leaning forward to catch her words. Sarah was describing a teenager she had been working with, someone who had aged out of foster care and was struggling to find stability. Her voice carried the kind of passionate concern that couldn't be faked, the deep empathy of someone who genuinely cared about others' well-being. "He's been sleeping rough for 3 weeks," she was saying to her companions. "The system failed him completely, but he's got such potential. I've been trying to find him a place in one of the training programs, something that can give him both shelter and purpose." One of her friends suggested contacting a local charity, but Sarah shook her head. "I already tried there. They're full up until spring. But I'm not giving up on him. There has to be someone willing to take a chance." James glanced at William and saw tears in the prince's eyes. Here was his birth mother, unknowingly echoing the same commitment to service that had driven William's own charitable work throughout his life. "She's just like you described, Diana," James whispered. "The same passion for helping people." William nodded, unable to speak. The irony was devastating. He had spent his life trying to honor what he thought was Diana's legacy, never knowing that his deepest instincts came from the woman sitting 20 feet away. As the conversation continued, James noticed other similarities. Sarah's laugh was bright and genuine, exactly like William's when he was truly amused. She listened intently when others spoke, giving them her complete attention in a way that made them feel heard and valued. Even her facial expressions, the way she tilted her head when thinking, mirrored gestures that William had displayed since childhood. "She keeps photos in her wallet," William observed quietly. Sarah had pulled out her phone to show her friends pictures of some of the young people she had helped over the years. But she also produced an old-fashioned wallet, the kind that unfolded to reveal plastic sleeves for photographs. "Probably pictures of the kids she's mentored," James suggested, but William was studying the wallet intently, and suddenly his face went pale. "James," he whispered urgently, "that wallet, I've seen it before." "What do you mean?" "In the hospital records Camilla showed me. There was a photograph of Sarah from 1982, and she was holding that same wallet. She's kept it for 40 years. The implications hit them both simultaneously. If Sarah had kept the same wallet for 4 decades, what else had she preserved from that time? What mementos might she have from the son she thought she had lost? As if sensing their attention, Sarah looked up from her conversation and glanced around the cafe. For a heart-stopping moment, her eyes met William's across the room. James saw recognition flicker across her face. Not of who William was, but something deeper and more instinctive. She stared at him for several seconds, her expression puzzled and searching. William froze completely, his coffee cup halfway to his lips, unable to look away from the woman who had given him life. "Excuse me," Sarah said to her friends, rising from her chair. "I'll be right back." James felt panic surge through him as Sarah began walking toward their table. William looked like a deer caught in headlights, all his careful planning forgotten in the face of this unexpected direct encounter. "I'm sorry to bother you," Sarah said when she reached their table, her voice soft and pleasant, "but I couldn't help noticing. You look very familiar. Have we met somewhere?" William opened his mouth, but no sound came out. James could see him struggling to maintain his composure as he stared into the face of his birth mother. The disguise that had seemed so clever now felt paper-thin under her questioning gaze. "I don't think so," William finally managed, his voice slightly higher than usual. "I'm just visiting from London." Sarah tilted her head, studying him more closely. "It's the strangest thing. You remind me of someone, but I can't place who. Your eyes, the way you hold yourself, it's very familiar." The maternal instincts she had been denied for 40 years were asserting themselves in ways neither scientific nor logical. Some primitive part of her recognized the child she had carried, even though her conscious mind couldn't make the connection. "I get that a lot," William said weakly. "I have one of those faces." Sarah smiled, the same warm expression that had captivated James in the photographs. "Well, I hope you enjoy Edinburgh. It's a wonderful city, especially this time of year." She turned to go, then stopped and looked back.
I don't suppose you're interested in volunteer work.
"We're always looking for people to help with youth programs, and something about you suggests you might understand young people who are struggling to find their place in the world." The invitation was innocent, friendly, and absolutely devastating. Here was his birth mother unknowingly inviting her own son to join the work that had defined her life. Work dedicated to helping lost children find their way home.
"Thank you," William whispered. "That's very kind."
Sarah returned to her table, but James noticed she continued to glance in their direction throughout the rest of her meeting. There was something about William that had captured her attention in ways she couldn't explain. When Sarah and her friends finally left the cafe an hour later, William remained seated, staring at the door long after she had disappeared. "She knew," he said finally. "On some level, she recognized me." James nodded, having seen the same inexplicable connection. "What now?" William pulled out his phone and showed James a text message he had composed but not yet sent. It was addressed to Sarah Mitchell's email, which he had found through his research. "Dear Miss Mitchell," it read, "I'm a writer working on a story about the impact of social workers on vulnerable youth. I was impressed by what I heard about your work today at the Thistle Cafe. Would you be willing to meet for an interview? I believe your story could help many people understand the importance of what you do." "You're going to contact her directly?" James asked, alarmed. "I have to," William replied. "Meeting her today, seeing who she really is, hearing her talk about her work, I can't make a decision about the truth without understanding how it would affect her. She deserves to know her son is alive, but she also deserves to have that revelation come in a way that honors the life she's built." James understood the impossible position William found himself in. The woman they had just met was everything he had hoped she would be. Kind, dedicated, strong enough to handle the truth. But she was also someone who had built a meaningful life around helping others, a life that would be completely upended by learning her son was the future King of England. "If you contact her, you're crossing a line you can't uncross," James warned. William nodded grimly. "I crossed that line the moment I decided to come here. Now I have to decide whether to honor the woman who gave me life or protect the institution that stole me from her." He pressed send on the message, and James watched 40 years of carefully maintained lies begin to crumble with the simple tap of a finger. Outside the Thistle Cafe, Edinburgh continued its daily rhythm, unaware that in a small corner table, the future of the British monarchy had just taken a step toward either redemption or destruction. 3 days after their return from Edinburgh, William received a reply from Sarah Mitchell. Her response was warm and enthusiastic, agreeing to meet for what she believed was a journalistic interview about her social work. She suggested meeting at her youth centre, where she could show him some of the programs that had been most successful in helping troubled young people. James found William in the same portrait hall where this crisis had begun, staring at Sarah's email on his phone. The scattered documents from Camilla's revelation had been organised into neat files, but new materials had appeared. Psychological assessments about the impact of family secrets, constitutional law texts exploring succession crises, and most tellingly, draft letters that had been written and rewritten dozens of times.
I've been trying to write to Kate, William said without looking up.
Trying to find words to explain what I've learned, what I'm about to do. But how do you tell your wife that your entire identity is a lie? How do you explain to your children that their claim to the throne comes from a fraud committed before they were born? James had watched William struggle with this impossible burden for days. The prince had grown thinner, more drawn, carrying the weight of secrets that threatened to destroy everything he held dear. What did you decide about meeting with Sarah again? William set his phone down and walked to the window, overlooking the castle grounds. Winter had settled over Windsor, and the barren trees seemed to mirror the desolation in his spirit. I'm going to tell her everything, he said quietly. Not as a prince seeking absolution, but as a son who needs his mother to help him choose between truth and duty. The decision was both inevitable and terrifying. James understood that William had reached the point where living with the lie had become more unbearable than facing the consequences of the truth. The meeting is tomorrow afternoon, William continued. At her youth center. She's excited to share her work with someone she thinks might help tell the story of what these programs accomplish. The irony was heartbreaking. Sarah was eagerly anticipating the chance to discuss the life's work that had helped her cope with losing her son, never knowing that her son was the one coming to meet her. Sir, have you considered what happens if she can't handle the revelation? If learning the truth destroys rather than heals? William turned to face him, and James saw that the prince had aged years in the few days since Edinburgh. I've considered it constantly. But James, I've also realized something else. Sarah Mitchell spent 40 years believing her child was dead, grieving for a son she never got to know. If there's any chance that learning he's alive could bring her peace instead of pain, don't I owe her that possibility? That evening, Kate found William in his study, surrounded by the evidence of his shattered world. She had sensed his distress for days, but had respected his need for space to work through whatever was troubling him. Now, seeing the depth of his anguish, she could no longer stay silent. William, she said softly, settling into the chair across from his desk. Whatever this is, whatever you're carrying, you don't have to bear it alone. He looked up at her, this woman who had stood by him through every challenge, who had given him children and stability and a love he had never thought possible. The thought of potentially losing her because of something that had happened before he was even aware of his own existence was almost unbearable. Kate, he began, then stopped, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. What I'm going to tell you will change everything you thought you knew about me, about us, about our children's future. She leaned forward, her expression serious but unafraid. Then tell me. For the next hour, William laid out everything. Camilla's revelation, the documents, the meeting with Sarah, the impossible choice between truth and duty. Kate listened in stunned silence as the foundation of their life together crumbled and reformed in ways neither of them could have imagined. When he finished, she sat quietly for a long moment, processing the implications of what she had learned. Finally, she spoke. So our children, their claim to the throne, comes from a lie, William finished. They're not royal blood. They're the grandchildren of a Scottish social worker who was robbed of her son 40 years ago. Kate stood and moved to the window, looking out at the grounds where their children often played, where they had imagined a future of service and tradition continuing through generations. What are you going to do? She asked finally. I'm going to meet Sarah Mitchell tomorrow and tell her the truth. All of it. And then I'm going to ask her what she thinks I should do. Kate turned back to him, and William saw something unexpected in her expression. Not fear or anger, but a kind of relief. Good, she said firmly. It's time this lie ended. Her support gave William strength he hadn't known he possessed. Together they began planning for a future that neither could predict, but both knew would be built on truth rather than deception. The next afternoon, William arrived at Sarah's youth center alone. James had offered to accompany him, but William knew this conversation needed to happen between a son and his mother, without witnesses or intermediaries. The center was exactly what he had expected. A converted warehouse filled with art supplies, computers, game tables, and comfortable seating areas where young people could gather safely. Sarah met him at the entrance, her face bright with enthusiasm for sharing her work. Mr. Williams, she said, using the false name he had provided. Welcome to the Beacon Youth Center. I'm so excited to show you what we've accomplished here. For the first hour, she led him through the facility, introducing him to staff members and young people who had found stability through the programs she had developed. William saw immediately why her work was so successful. Every interaction was genuine, every relationship built on mutual respect and understanding. These kids remind me why I do this work, Sarah said as they watched a group of teenagers working on a community service project. They've all been written off by someone, told they don't matter or don't belong.
But when you give them a chance, when you believe in them, they can accomplish anything.
William realized he was seeing himself reflected in these young people. Lost souls searching for identity and purpose, finding meaning through the guidance of someone who truly cared about their well-being.
They settled in Sarah's office for what she believed would be an interview about her methods and philosophy. William looked around at the walls covered with photographs of young people she had helped over the decades, thank you letters from families, awards for community service that had clearly been given reluctantly by someone who preferred to work behind the scenes.
Before we begin the interview, William said, his voice barely steady, there's something I need to tell you about why I'm really here. Something in his tone made Sarah look at him more carefully. For the second time, William saw that flicker of recognition cross her face, the inexplicable sense that she knew him from somewhere.
I'm not really a writer, he began, and my name isn't Williams.
My name is William, but my last name is different than what I told you.
Sarah's expression grew puzzled, but not alarmed. She had dealt with enough troubled young people to recognize when someone was struggling to reveal a difficult truth. My real name is William Arthur Philip Louis, he continued, watching her face carefully. But more importantly, my birth name was William Mitchell. I was born on June 24, 1982, at Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, to a nurse named Sarah Mitchell. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. Sarah's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, recognition, and finally, a dawning understanding that seemed to hit her like a physical blow.
That's not possible,
she whispered. My baby died. The doctors told me. They showed me the death certificate.
William reached into his jacket and pulled out the documents Camilla had given him, along with the photographs and medical records he had gathered.
Your baby didn't die, Sarah. Your son was taken and raised as someone else. You're my mother, and I'm the future King of England. The revelation shattered the careful calm of Sarah's office. She stared at the documents with shaking hands, seeing the truth laid out in medical records, DNA tests, and photographs that chronicled a deception spanning 4 decades. The real prince died, William explained gently, and in desperation, the royal family took your healthy son and claimed him as their own. You were told your baby had died, but he was raised in palaces while you spent 40 years grieving for a child who was alive. Sarah looked up at him, and William saw his own eyes reflected in hers, the same expression of determination and compassion that had defined both their lives in different ways. You're telling me, she said slowly, that the son I mourned for 40 years has been alive all this time? That he grew up to be you? William nodded, tears streaming down his face. I'm telling you that every young person you've helped, every life you've changed, every moment you've spent making the world better for lost children, you were honoring the son you thought you'd lost, never knowing that son was trying to honor you in return. The silence stretched between them as Sarah processed the magnitude of what she had learned. Finally, she stood and moved to a photograph on her wall, a picture of herself holding a newborn baby, taken moments after birth. I've kept this for 40 years, she said quietly. I took it with a camera one of the other nurses had just before they told me he was gone. I look at it every day and wonder what kind of man my son would have become. She turned back to William, and he saw not shock or anger, but a mother's love that had never dimmed despite 4 decades of separation. You became exactly the kind of man I hoped you would be, she said simply. Someone who cares about others, who uses his position to help people who need it most. I've followed your charitable work for years, never knowing you were watching your own son, William finished. They stood looking at each other across the office, 2 people whose lives had been shaped by a lie, but who had somehow found their way to the same values, the same commitment to service, the same understanding of what it meant to help others find their place in the world. What happens now? Sarah asked. William took a deep breath, knowing that his answer would determine not just their future, but the future of the monarchy itself. Now you help me decide whether the truth is worth destroying everything I was raised to protect, or whether some lies are too costly to maintain, no matter what they might cost to reveal. Sarah Mitchell, the mother who had unknowingly given birth to a king, looked at her son and smiled with the same warmth that had defined her life's work. Then we have a lot to talk about, she said. Let me make us some tea, and you can tell me about the life you've lived, and I'll tell you about the life I've lived missing you. And together, we'll figure out how to build something true from all these years of lies. As evening fell over Edinburgh, a mother and son sat together for the first time in 40 years, beginning a conversation that would ultimately reshape the British monarchy and prove that some truths are powerful enough to heal even the deepest wounds.